Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And when you've been reading comics for as long as I have, you come to understand that major upheavals often come in waves. Now yes, it's true that writers, publishers, and editors love overhyping a particular story, claiming it's going to change everything you thought you knew about a particular character or franchise, but in some instances, that's not hype. Big, groundbreaking visions can and do change certain comics in major ways, for better and for worse. Spider-Man, X-Men, Justice League, Avengers, Batman, you name it, they've all undergone their share of upheavals. And granted, some of those stories end up getting undone, a lot infuriating retcons like One More Day, but others actually lay a foundation that lasts for decades, such as DC's Comics' first Crisis event. But of all the upheavals I've followed over the years in comics, few have been as remarkable as the Krakoa era in the X-Men comics. And me being a lifelong X-Men fan, the bar for remarkable is very high, especially for the good kind. But it really is difficult to overstate just how incredible the Krakoa era was for X-Men comics, and it's just as difficult to understate how distressing it was to see it end the way it did. But to truly appreciate Krakoa, it's also necessary to understand the eras that preceded it. Because going back to the Grant Morrison era of the early 2000s, it's not unreasonable to say that X-Men, from a purely creative standpoint, was really all over the place in terms of vision, quality, and impact. There really were some major moments in stories like House of M, Messiah Complex, Schism, and Avengers vs. X-Men. Those moments came with major changes to how, where, and why the X-Men did what they did. And at times, it did get pretty bleak, such as when the entire mutant population was severely culled by the Scarlet Witch during M-Day. It also got genuinely hopeful and uplifting with moments like Messiah Complex. But for the most part, these eras had the X-Men struggling to stay unified, always on the brink of extinction, often facing all sorts of internal dramas. Along the way, numerous characters died and came back to life. New threats emerged while old enemies returned. Romantic subplots blossomed and then fell apart. There are even a few new apocalyptic timelines to emerge. Now, none of that is new to X-Men. These kinds of dramatic struggles are a big part of their appeal. But then, in 2019, Jonathan Hickman came along and dared to give the X-Men a bigger, bolder vision. Through House of X and Powers of 10, 12 simple issues with astonishing artwork by Pepe Larraz, the entire mutant world took on a bold new form. Through machinations in the past, present, and distant future, as well as a complete reimagining of the role of Moira McTaggart, the X-Men recognized themselves and their fellow mutants with Krakoa. This living mutant island, who first appeared in 1975's giant-sized X-Men, didn't just give mutants a new place to call home. It gave them a foundation for a new sense of identity. They were no longer just a hodgepodge of individuals who were born different, needing a safe haven where they could hide from hate, bigotry, and killer robots. They were now their own society with their own unique culture. And unlike previous mutant nations like Utopia and Genosha, Krakoa would not isolate itself from the international community. It sought to function as a real player in the geopolitical scene. It even offered unique resources in the form of special Krakoan medicines that would benefit humanity. And, most importantly, it gave mutants from all walks of life a chance to share in this opportunity, even those who had clashed with the X-Men in the past. The idea, the vision, and the extent to which it reflected Charles Xavier's dream, it really was incredible, seeing it manifest in House of X, Powers of 10. And in the numerous comics and series that spun out of it, we watched Krakoa evolve alongside the X-Men and other mutants. Now, it certainly wasn't a smooth process. In series like X-Force, X-Corp, New Mutants, and plenty of others, we follow the many trials, tribulations, and setbacks. But even with those setbacks, the foundation Krakoa established was profound. It really did feel like a natural evolution of Charles Xavier's dream. A common refrain from the very beginning of this era was, "It's not a dream if it's real." Krakoa, imperfect as it might have been, gave that dream a real, tangible form, and it provided fertile ground for many stories, as well as significant character developments. Some, such as Synch, Forge, Mystique, and Jean Grey, benefited a great deal from these developments. It also set the stage for some truly memorable events, such as the first Hellfire Gala, in which multiple X-Men used their powers to terraform Mars in the span of a single evening. It really was a true testament to what mutants could accomplish when unified. While I can't speak for all X-Men fans, I feel like Krakoa gave us some of the most compelling developments we'd seen for the franchise in years. It was only just a few years before this that mutants were being cast aside by Marvel, placed in a state of limbo, literally and figuratively, just to make way for the Inhumans. Now, that dark period was mostly because of conflicting movie rights and the dominance of the MCU. I've already covered that in a previous video, so I won't dwell on it. But all anyone really needs to know is that House of X Powers of 10 really made the X-Men both relevant and prominent again. It re-established the X-Men was one of Marvel's most important franchises, and as a lifelong fan, I couldn't have been happier with the direction it was going. But even when Krakoa was at its best, I didn't doubt for a second that more upheavals would come. I certainly didn't expect Krakoa to be an intractable turning point for the X-Men. What Jonathan Hickman created was bound to change as other writers built on what he created. That happens all the time in comics, going back to the days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. But it's how the Krakoa era came to an end that is sure to affect its legacy. Again, creative upheavals are inevitable with modern comics. Things can never become too good or too bleak, otherwise the stories become stale. But what happened with Krakoa was more than just another narrative upheaval. It was a massive and frustrating step backwards for the X-Men. Even for fans who didn't like Krakoa, and there were certainly plenty who shared that sentiment, the way it played out rubbed everyone the wrong way. Initially, it was teased as this massive crossover event called Fall of X. And with an ominous title like that, it's natural to think that things are going to get dark. Things were already trending in that direction after the events of Sins of Sinister, an event that was basically a worst-case scenario for Krakoa. From the early days of House of X, the X-Men allowed Mr. Sinister to help them, but not surprisingly, he had his own agenda, which involved corrupting every prominent X-Men, creating multiple clones of himself, and attempting to ascend to a godlike state called Dominion. Believe me, it's even wilder than it sounds. And if nothing else, it proves that Mr. Sinister is one of Marvel's most menacing yet creative villains. But more than anything else, the revelations about Sinister's plot turned the world against Krakoa and mutants. And at the same time, Orchis, the anti-mutant pro-human evolution organization that first showed up in House of X, gained a great deal of influence. With help from Dr. Stasis, one of those Sinister clones I mentioned earlier, and Moira McTaggart, who became an irredeemably evil character after the events of Inferno, they stoked a whole new wave of hatred against mutants. They even went so far as to poison the medicines that the X-Men used to build bridges with humanity, turning them into a time bomb that they could activate at a moment's notice. Orchis basically became a much worse version of the Friends of Humanity and the Purifiers. They were a whole new level of cartoonish evil. And their hatred of mutants really didn't have much nuance to it. It was just hate in its ugliest, purest form. And the fruits of that hate ultimately manifested in the third Hellfire Gala in 2023, which effectively launched the events of Fall of X. Now, I won't mull over all the details, but in terms of elaborate plans, this one was uniquely devious. Orchis basically forced Charles Xavier to mind control every mutant he could and force them to walk through Krakoan gates. The plan wasn't just to force all mutants off the planet, it was an attempted extermination of the entire mutant population through and through. And if Xavier didn't do it, then Dr. Stasis would kill millions of humans, courtesy of the tainted drugs Krakoa sold to the world. It was a painful, heartbreaking moment. On top of that, they faced attacks by Nimrod and the newly minted Stark Sentinels, courtesy of Fei Long, who developed them using Iron Man technology that he stole from Tony Stark. In this attack, multiple characters were brutally slaughtered, including major characters like Jubilee, Cannonball, and Dazzler. Again, things got dark. Very, very dark. Now, things have been bleak before for the X-Men, but Fall of X really felt different. It really felt like the writers were going out of their way to make it feel worse than anything that had come before it. At times, it felt over the top just for the sake of it, and the actual substance within the stories was notably flat, lacking the big ideas and concepts that Jonathan Hickman used early on. While it's impossible to know for sure, these early issues of Fall of X felt like they were being influenced by editors over writers, as if the higher-ups at Marvel demanded that everything the X-Men built on Krakoa collapse in the worst possible way. Now, that may or may not have been the case, but regardless of editorial influence, the impact on every X-Men comic was still the same. As Fall of X played out, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just another round of generic mutant hatred. Marvel was setting the stage for Krakoa's complete destruction, as well as the destruction of all the progress they'd made for the entire era. This wasn't going to be a matter of shaking up what had been built on the foundation that Hickman forged. Marvel was essentially uprooting every plot, theme, and idea that Krakoa had inspired, and then casting it aside as though it were a mistake. It was very different than what happened to previous mutant nations like Utopia and Genosha. Yes, those were also mutant nations, but they were smaller byproducts of other ongoing plots. They never really became the core aspects of the larger mutant narrative. But Krakoa was more than that. It was established to be more from the very first issue. This wasn't just a nation, this was the X-Men and mutants at large building an identity for themselves, as many minorities in the real world often do. But Fall of X gave the distinct impression that this was a mistake, more so than anything Utopia or Genosha attempted. It sent the message that mutants can't have their own nation, they can't have their own haven, they can never have a place, a culture, or an identity to call their own. And even if you step outside the larger themes surrounding X-Men, that is a terrible message. Beyond just being a depressing premise for an X-Men comic, it tells every minority that they invite hatred and violence by trying to thrive on their own. Even after those who hate, fear, and oppress them attack them repeatedly on multiple occasions, they're still foolish for even trying to assert themselves. Now, does that mean that Krakoa, as both a concept and a story, was completely without flaws? Of course not. Its foundations definitely had plenty of shortcomings, oversights, and dangers. That was plenty apparent in the early days of House of X Powers of 10. But those who went so far as to call Krakoa an ethno-state doomed to fail, they're missing the forest from the trees. Setting aside the fact that being a mutant isn't an ethnicity, Krakoa represented a step forward for mutants. This wasn't a nation forged out of desperation like Utopia, and it wasn't formed to just be a safe haven like Genosha. Mutants of all stripes came together to form this homeland. It wasn't just the X-Men or Charles Xavier leading them into a new future. They all helped build it together. And that distinction matters. That's why its destruction hits differently than the destruction of Utopia and Genosha. Because that important step forward that Krakoa represented, now it feels like a punishment. It's as though mutants and the X-Men have no right to make any progress of any kind in their struggle. And if they dare make that effort, they can expect to be violently pulled back to square fucking one. And that, more than anything, is the worst part of how the Krakoa era ended. On top of another mutant nation being brutally destroyed, it basically sends the X-Men, their allies, and the entire mutant race back to where they started. Even before Fall of X concluded, Marvel announced a major series of relaunches as part of an effort called From the Ashes. And it essentially spoiled that nothing from Krakoa, not the nation, not the concept, and not a single positive benefit that it had granted, would be carried forward. Mutants had to go back to living amongst humans. And keep in mind, these are the same humans that tried to slaughter them, deport them to Mars, and send them to internment camps during Fall of X. And yet From the Ashes says mutants are now hated and feared more than ever, and all I can say to that is, why? Seriously, why? How does this make sense given what happens over the course of Fall of X? Mutants lose their nation and are almost wiped out yet again, but instead of sympathy, they're hated more than ever? Now maybe that'll be explained, but given how Krakoa ends, it just feels so dumb and contrived. Because it's not like the truth about Orcus's lies didn't come out over the course of Fall of X. Ben Urich flat out exposes Orcus's crimes during the Hellfire Gala. And Ms. Marvel helped expose how mutants were being treated at internment camps. Even the Avengers went out of their way to fight against Orcus, aligning themselves with the X-Men in ways we've never seen before. Yet the world doesn't hate the Avengers more than ever. Sure, I get being hated is a big part of the X-Men's overarching story, but the total lack of consistency is just frustrating as hell. Now, at the end of the day, I am still an X-Men fan. I'll still give this new From the Ashes era a chance. But no matter how it plays out, it will always have the baggage of being a massive regression from what Krakoa established. It'll be the harshest reminder that Marvel will never let the X-Men grow or evolve beyond a certain point. And if anyone dares to try, they can expect a harsh, brutal regression at some point. Now, I don't doubt for a second that there will be more creative upheavals in the coming years. Things are very dark now after the end of Krakoa. They'll likely stay dark for a while before some new creative team comes along to give it a boost. The X-Men's eventual arrival into the MCU, as well as the reception of X-Men 97, is sure to have plenty of influences in that regard. But wherever it leads, however it plays out, I'm confident in saying that the Krakoa era has already made its mark. And I think it's a positive mark for the most part. I believe that 20 years from now, fans will still look back fondly on this era. They'll see it as a high point for the X-Men, both in terms of their story and the overall quality of the comics that came from it. For me, Krakoa is already one of my favorite eras of all time for X-Men. It really demonstrated how far they can go if they're given an opportunity to evolve in a meaningful way. And no matter how it ended, no matter how dark, disappointing, or frustrating the aftermath might have been, Krakoa will always represent just how uncanny the X-Men can be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.